us is the landscape that's happening now as a result of what we've been working together before. So, and now we go on more into details, dive into the connection between user experience research and how it drives culture. So if you consider about user research, it's basically reduce the friction in the adoption and enable understanding the recipients of your service strategies and to connect what the business strategy is with your members. They call it members instead of user. Let's try to start from tonight. And but then if you look at the ecosystem, so if you look at user experience research on the ecosystem, the idea of understanding the networks and the interaction is more connected, is more contextual, and therefore there are more angles that need to be untangled. So I just want to give you this as a initial journey that we did together where now Cobiome is. So if we go through the head, this is actually the journey that we start off. We started off just with our mission. So what's the mission that we can rely on at the beginning? It was just understanding also the team charter canvas is the outcome, and understanding of what the mission statement in the beginning was just the first draft, but give some direction. Then developed in the vision, and the outcome of the vision was to focus on some challenges that a service platform could impact on the given industry in some in the ecosystem. However, even there, the value proposition was still developing. And when we realized the importance of understanding the ecosystem, the workshop was very insightful again to understand what are the relationships that we need to focus on. What are the partners that are more important to us to develop the understanding of the ecosystem we want to serve. So, and today we're going to just focus on the last part, the customer journey mapping. That's the tool that enables us to really understand how these user experience researcher enable alignment, I think was an understanding of leadership in a different way, and also diversity of expertise in the team. So I think if we can now move the next slide. So here we're going to have, I think, Karolina that probably should be now. We can hear. You can hear you, Karolina?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, so Karolina is currently sitting in Atlanta, and she's an ability consultant. So before I start off for the journey we did together, maybe Karolina, you will introduce yourself before I start.
Sure. So yes, I'm the head of international operations at Cobiome, and I'm based in Atlanta. And I'm a consultant in the sustainability field for 20 years or so. But now I'm in the regeneration part of it, towards regeneration and thriving. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to do the presentation now? Or?
If you give me 1 minute, I'll leave you the floor. I just want to, before this model, I just want to make the audience aware how we arrived here. So we started actually from a desk research. We start saying we're going to focus on categories. The categories was just a card that we created, say, for example, packaging, and say these are the pains and the gains in categories. These are the jobs to be done. And this approach as desk research gave us not probably much flexibility to understand the market, to understand how we could then shape the platform to serve these categories. Therefore, we moved towards understanding how we can really connect with the client that could be engaged in the platform. So when we start collaborating with Karolina, we understood that the personas cannot be applied fully if we are looking at members as a network, to understand how the network, what the network needs to be engaged in the community building business model. So instead, the archetypes to understand as a mindset gave us much more understanding of how we can approach a certain client based on some assumption. But this will come later, so I will leave now a few minutes to Karolina to explain us this model that gave us access to more understanding. So if we go on the next slide, so what Karolina was mentioned here is just one. Now we're going to bring a real example of what we experienced in our collaboration. So we call the company Heinz that we did initial research based on desk research. what I mentioned before, just assumption based on market research. And these were the 3 points that we assumed that in our journey, that as a Cobiome was understood during our process, okay, we were thinking these are the inquiries that we're going to focus on to deliver value to this company. This was just based on what we assumed to some research and our outreach process, which was probably a bit limited based on some assumption without the archetypes, the personas. So when we start talking and connecting with the industries, and we start to have in the first interviews, myself, I'm gonna share this interview with this company. Let's call it Company 1, where we applied what Karolina mentioned before. And the archetypes were archetypes number 2, the sustainable, the resilient. And based on these archetypes and mindset, we could design basically the right type of questions that could unlock more understanding of what are the services that the platform, the ecosystem, Cobiome could deliver. So these are just the result of the mindset that Karolina and us, we created together. So actually there was a different type of journey. Of course, it's an iterating process, but give us more flexibility, more understanding of how a certain type of members or clients can be addressed in the platform. So here you can see there was a lack of sustainability strategy, potential need of training with biomimicry, or enhance the processing operation. These actually create more light and awareness of what we could do, what we can do. So this journey you can see is the customer journey mapping. This is the point I was trying to make in the beginning in the agenda, and now we're going to go through what we shared also with Ilgvart with here. That these are what we learned, and Ilgvart that also worked with us in the beginning of this journey, and they gave us more insight. Will give a bit more understanding.
I helped with the exercise, and in the exercise we took a hypothetical case and we tried to walk it through the different steps from door to door, and during the process then of course some unclear questions came up, and some important touch points as well could be identified. So that was something that was helpful, and like a bottom-up exercise, and something that could be then used and repeated for different members and participants within the network.
Yeah, I think another part of this, the value of this exercise was to understand how we could understand the value of the network. So how we could manage the network to then leverage the real value of the network. Or if a client or a member come, as Ilgvart said, what actually is the value that we co-create with the client, and what happens when the client leave, and how will be the type of communication we want to have to create retention, for example. So this customer journey mapping brought us together in the room to co-create and collaborate to have this sort of awareness how the ecosystem needs, how we could facilitate this. So it was Fabian, there was business operation, there was Karolina, there was myself, there was research. So this is an exercise that we want to bring in today that hopefully could drive in your projects a collaborative ideation. So that's just an example. So if we go through on the next slide, I think what we want to share here is that the type of a collaboration is changing. So this is just to mention that from a traditional approach to a digital collaboration ecosystem, what we experience in what we share today is a different type of leadership that happened to take charge ownership of a certain type of process and tool that also enable us to understand that a platform-powered ecosystem give more room and light to emerging markets, emerging industries that might have much more impact if an ecosystem, the served by day platform, could then enable them to connect with the members. So, and also the type of cross-disciplinary approach that happened within the team, it's something that actually gave value, not just internally, but externally. So, and then moving ahead, I think here I would like to share what we applied. This kind of a toolkit that probably might be useful to look at if you want to take inspiration, but that's what I used and then kind of adapt through the process. So here there is actually plenty of canvases, but I deploy resources accordingly. That was probably a process that happened throughout our experience. Probably this could be useful, hopefully, for you. And moving ahead, I think this is eventually what are the lessons learned that I want to, again, emphasize together, that embracing this type of approach is continuous organizing, just like happened today. As an ensemble of collaborators, we just keep sharing what we learn. Hopefully, that could be an example of a different type of way of working. So, and eventually, community strategies really, the spine is to understand value co-creation. So Fabian mentioned some example, and as much as I try to share the example internally, how this value co-creation really made the drive for Cobiome or for other ecosystem that everybody will create. And finally, user research is probably the building block for internal alignment and focus. So I think the next slide is just to say that if now there are any open questions, there are burning questions about the event or what we talked so far, please share your questions. Otherwise, we go into just this co-creation model in terms of what are the questions that for you in your projects or in your view are important to frame an ecosystem thinking. So do you have any question about what we talked so far? Would you like to add anything or anything you would like to address?